Several years ago, when my late wife Elizabeth was involved with children's work at the Gospel Hall, she was trying to track down a family who had moved to another part of the city. She was able to enlist the help of a Christian gentleman from those parts who was able to make contact with that family. Elizabeth called the Christian afterwards to thank him for the effort he had put into the job, and he replied with words similar to words in today's reading: "We are workers together." So let's read from 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 to 5. "We then, as workers together with him, beseech you also that ye receive not the grace of God in vain. For he saith, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation have I succoured thee. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Giving no offence in anything, that the ministry be not blamed, but in all things approving ourselves as the ministers of God, in much patience, in afflictions and necessities, in distresses, in stripes, in imprisonments, in tumults, in labours, in watchings, in fastings." Some people are just like children. When you offer to help them with a task, they reply, "I will do it myself." All this time, you know that they really could do with some assistance. Then there's the opposite situation. A father is working at a project when he asks his young son to help him. Now, we know quite obviously that the father could do the job himself, but there's something else working here. The father actually wants the child to be involved, even though he doesn't need him to be involved. It is a quite different situation. So Paul begins chapter 6 with these words: "We then, as workers together with him," in verse 1. Although we should note that those final two words, "with him," are actually supplied by the translators of the King James Version. Strictly speaking, Paul is not so much indicating that we are working with God, although we do read that we are labourers together with God in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9. But he's rather indicating that Paul regards himself as a fellow worker with the Corinthians in God's service. Both he and the Corinthians are on the same team. They're not in competition with each other, and they should be serving not independently of each other, but in fellowship with each other. As a fellow worker, he entreats them not to act contrary to the grace of God that they had received, that ye receive not the grace of God in vain, also in verse 1. The danger was that in their behaviour they could undermine the grace of God rather than further it, and it is possible that we could be guilty of that as well. It would be terrible if, in thinking we were standing for the truth, we were actually undermining it because of a lack of grace. Now, working together requires grace, and Paul goes on to illustrate how grace is seen. "I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation have I succoured thee," in verse 2. This quotation from Isaiah chapter 49, verse 8 gives a lovely illustration of the grace of God. His ear is open to his people, and his hand is open to their aid. That is the character of this day of grace, and it is the character that we should display in our service for God. Now, that was the character of the apostle, giving no offence in anything, that the ministry be not blamed, is what he writes in verse 3. Paul served in such a way that he was not an obstacle to the gospel, so that no one could use his behaviour as an excuse not to respond. When he wrote, "in all things approving ourselves as the ministers of God," in verse 4, he was explaining how that in every circumstance he endeavoured to commend the gospel. He kept serving despite the many trials that came his way, and whatever the hardship. I shine the light on my own life, and I wonder if the same could be said about me.